So this, and believe it or not, I was putting my slides together about 2 weeks ago, and I was just about to insert this photograph when I heard about the death of Professor Sir Michael Rutter. He had been going to be in my presentation anyway. Michael Rutter died on the 23rd of October, but he was the head of department when I was trying to pull this idea together into a training fellowship. And I was very lucky to be able to ask his enormous mind for some advice on this. And he said, essentially, that's a great idea, but you would need to compare a lot more than 2 orphanages. You would need a randomized controlled trial. I knew enough about Michael Rutter by then to know that he would be right. He had a really incredible talent for getting right to the heart of the problem. But I was perplexed. I just couldn't see at first how tossing a coin, essentially, could help. So going back even further, I have always been stubborn. When I was about 8, I remember asking my mum, "What's a peer?" And she said, "That is someone of your own age and stage." And I said something like, "Nah." And I argued so strongly that eventually she just said, "Look, believe what you like." This was my idea of what a peer was. And of course I was right, but I didn't learn anything that day because I just wasn't willing to listen. A bit of a story of my life at that age. So I was not willing to accept uncertainty. And this is a quote from Mark Twain. He said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, but what you know for sure, it just ain't so." And that really is the heart of randomized controlled trials. The first known medical randomized controlled trial was in 1931. And about 10 days ago, I looked on the Cochrane database, which is an important information store of international scientific studies. And there was 1,815,356 randomized controlled trials in medicine listed. And you can bet that if you went back today, you'd probably find more listed already. And this is just a quote from a paper from The Lancet, that randomized controlled trials provide the most rigorous test of preventive, diagnostic, and therapeutic interventions. They are ubiquitously referred to as the gold standard of empirical biomedical investigation. And I think that I suspect that some of the COVID vaccine skeptics have been concerned that the vaccine trials were perhaps done too quickly. But believe me, they had the full weight of our incredible NHS trials infrastructure behind them. And I know this personally because the trials that I was conducting at the time of the lockdown, we had to get right out of the research facilities so that the research nurses could focus all of their time on the vaccine trials. And I know that this was the case right across the UK. So colleagues of ours were working 60 hours a day just trying to get the research done rigorously on those vaccines. So personally, I'm very satisfied, but I can see why. It normally takes years and years to develop the evidence base for a new drug, for example. So what do randomized controlled trials contribute? And there are probably scientists in the audience who can think of other things, but for me, there are 5 key things. They question the status quo. I'm going to go through each of these. They address what we call confounding. They compare the current gold standard with something that might even be better. But then they also acknowledge that the new can be harmful. And they try to embrace fairness. So let's start with questioning the status quo. We all love the status quo as humans because it's comfortable. But this is a quote from a really good friend and colleague of mine, Professor Phil Wilson. He once said at a big health board meeting in Glasgow, research is by definition subversive. And there was a kind of audible gasp. But of course he is right, because what we do with research is we look at the kind of table of the status quo and we kind of upend it to see what's underneath, see if we want to change it, which is actually quite a subversive thing to do. And errors in the established orthodoxy are often only obvious in retrospect, or we talk about in medicine when you look back with the retrospectoscope. So here's just a silly example, but the glass harmonica was very popular in the 18th century. I'm sure many of you will have had that great fun experience of licking your finger and winding it around a wine glass and it goes. And there used to be whole orchestras made up of these, all tuned to different levels. But its music was thought to drive people mad with its ethereal vibrations. And this is actually a quote from a musicologist, a German musicologist all the time. It excessively stimulates the nerves, plunges the player into a nagging depression and hence into a dark and melancholy mood. It is an apt method for slow self-annihilation. And now many scholars think that it was actually due to the lead poisoning from the lead in the glass. But there's never been a randomized control trial, so I might be wrong. But there have been randomized controlled trials of treatment for head injury. And when I was a junior doctor, we were taught to give steroids to people who had had a head injury. And since then, randomized controlled trials have shown us that more people survive head injuries if you don't give them steroids. And these, they were called the crash trials, I think were the most incredibly brave trials because they were done with people who weren't even conscious and they had to get consent from relatives at a terribly distressing time. But thank goodness they did, because they've saved lives. So for me, a really important thing about randomized controlled trials is that they address what we call confounding. So, of course, I went to our most profound and intellectually rigorous source of information for the definition of a confounder, Wikipedia. And it said, a variable that influences both the dependent variable and independent variable, causing a spurious association. Or if you just look at dictionary.com, to mix or associate by mistake, truths confounded with error, something that kind of gets in the way of what you think is going on. Here is an example. So imagine you've done a fantastic study and you've demonstrated a statistically significant association between karaoke singing and liver disease. Wow, submit it to the Lancet. And if you're not a scientist, getting a paper in the Lancet is every medical scientist's dream. But they reject it. They say you've not thought about other explanations here. What lubricates karaoke singing? What makes us more confident with our singing as we sing along with Beyonce? Alcohol. And of course, we know that alcohol is one of the strongest causal factors of liver disease. So actually, alcohol is confounding the relationship between karaoke singing and liver disease. And actually, there probably wasn't a relationship there at all. So you have to do another study. You don't get your Lancet paper this time. But this is actually an almost real example. I've embellished it slightly, but I really was standing in front of Barking Town Hall, a room full of childcare decision makers back in 2018. And my role was to introduce an intervention aiming to try and help them make better decisions. And it's quite interesting because the social workers and the lawyers weren't sitting together. All the lawyers were sitting up in the right-hand corner of the room, chatting away with their friends. So this is where I've embellished a bit, but just imagine that this new intervention is really amazing. It's a training program for childcare decision makers, and each point is emphasized by a Greek chorus, just to really hammer it home. So you just divide the room in two. You have group one on the left, group two on the right, and you introduce your new intervention with your Greek chorus into the right-hand side of the room. And the intervention seems to work quite well. But there's a catch, and that is that all of the lawyers, or most of the lawyers, are sitting together, and most of them are in group 2. And that is actually problematic because as a group, lawyers and social workers differ. So if you look at the type of school that they predominantly attended, more lawyers went to private schools, almost certainly. The gender mix probably differs. Probably more social workers will be female and more will also be Black. So you've got 2 different groups there. And you've got 75% of your lawyers in group 2. So how does a randomised controlled trial address confounding? So imagine if, as everybody files into the room, you toss a coin and you either get heads, group 1, tails, group 2, and you've just to sit beside the next person. Actually, you would use something a bit more technical than that, something maybe like permuted block randomization, which is just a way of kind of mixing up your list of random numbers in a way that prevents the lawyers from guessing who's going to be randomized next and stand in a couple of places back so they still get to sit with their friends. So with a nice effective randomization process, you've now got your lawyers smoothly spread across your room, a bit like chocolate chips smoothly stirred into pancake batter. Not that I really want to compare lawyers with chocolate chips, but I think the thing for me that really helped me get my head around why randomization works is that it is like stirring. You want to get the whole mix to be completely mixed in, because what you then have is 2 identical halves if you put your line down the middle. And when you do that, you discover that actually your intervention really doesn't work for childcare decision makers. And what you also do in randomized controlled trials is you do lots of qualitative work to try and understand why. And when you do it in this study, you realise that, of course, the intervention only works for people who went to schools where Greek was still taught, because they could understand the emphasised messages of the Greek chorus. So you really needed to randomise in order to get rid of that. So lucky we did the trial, or we might have thought that this worked for everyone. So for me, reason number 3 that randomised controlled trials are important is that they compare the current gold standard with something that might even be better. I think the best example that has really convinced me about this is in the UK, many children with cancer are entered into randomised controlled trials. Perhaps most children with cancer. Trials are very common in cancer treatment. You know, when you think about this as a parent, you think, how could parents accept this level of uncertainty about their child? You know, the equivalent of tossing a coin. Then when you think about it, the doctors explain to parents that the trial is comparing the best treatment we have at the moment, the current gold standard, with something that they think might even be better. So you're thinking, God, you know, it's either going to be the certainly best we've got or something that might even be better. And then that makes sense. And for me, the key and the fascinating bit is that it's only ethical to do the study if the doctor is genuinely uncertain. So if you got a hint as a parent that they really knew which treatment was better, there's no way you would put your child into the trial. You'd say, no, give me treatment A, because I can tell you think it's better. That is the fundamental principle of randomized controlled trials. It's only ethical to do them if you're genuinely uncertain. And the kind of scientific term for that is equipoise. But there's got to be a balance between each side of the trial. And if you already know the answer, you shouldn't be doing the study. But going along with that is the acknowledgement in trials that the new treatment could actually be worse than the current gold standard. It could be actually harmful, as was found in the crash trials with head injury. And there's a paper that came out this year about harmful treatments in psychotherapy. So the study of potentially harmful treatments is an essential component of any systematic investigation of therapeutic methods. I think that's really important because we would never accept a new drug or a new vaccine that hadn't been subjected to rigorous randomized controlled trials. You've all heard of the FDA in America. They put all sorts of checks and balances that involve randomized controlled trials on the issuing of new treatments. And yet psychotherapy is a largely unregulated industry. But there have been trials that have shown that the wrong psychotherapy or even too much of the right psychotherapy can actually do more harm than good. And I think one of the biggest barriers to randomization in trials that compare psychological interventions with something else, so for example, social work, is that everyone assumes the psychological intervention is going to be better, or at least harmless. I feel as if in my job, I spend a lot of time trying to debunk that notion. And for me, the best way of debunking that notion is the Cambridge Somerville trial. This is one of the best trials ever conducted. So back in 1939, more than 500, what they used to call juvenile delinquents, young men who had committed crimes, were randomized to Service A, which was new services including counselling, academic tutoring, medical and psychiatric attention, referral to the YMCA, Boy Scouts, summer camps, community programmes. And because this was Cambridge, Massachusetts, not Cambridge, England, and there's really virtually no welfare system to speak of in the States, this was a really, really rich intervention. And the control group, so 50 of the young men were randomised to just checking in with the researchers. It really was a remarkable study. So they managed to follow up 94% of these young men over 30 years. Clearly, Service A is going to be better, right? Wrong. Those who received the new services had actually committed more crimes at every follow-up point over that 30 years. I happened to be at a conference a few years ago where there was an elderly statistician who had been, Jean McCord's been dead actually for, gosh, about 60 years now, but he had had the pleasure of being at a conference dinner with Jean McCord, and he said to her, "What went wrong?" And she said, "I wonder if it was the summer camps." So her notion was, and you can't prove that from this study, but her notion was that these were young men who were already committing crimes. So if you put them all together in summer camps, they could all learn from each other how to commit crimes even better. And actually, on the back of this trial and many others like it, we try not to do that anymore. We try not to put young men who committed crimes together. Oh, wait a minute, what about prisons? Yes. Well, we should know better. So last but not least for me, trials really try to embrace fairness. So there's a bit of a story to this for me, as Tamsin knows. We've been running a randomised controlled trial called the Best Services Trial, ? For several years now. And BEST aims to randomise about 280 families who've got preschool children coming into foster care in Glasgow and London into either a new infant mental health service or to social work services as usual, to find out whether the infant mental health service leads to better child mental health and to better legal decisions about whether the child should go home or be adopted. So quite a kind of radical intervention potentially. In 2015, we got funding from the National Institutes of Health Research, which is a big NHS, and you can imagine, the champagne was uncorked. We were very happy about this indeed. And then the Right Honourable Sir James Murphy, QC, said, "No, you're not. You're not randomising in the English family courts." And I want to emphasise, and I'll tell you why in a moment, he was absolutely correct to make that decision on the information that he had. But this was an absolute nightmare. I mean, I literally, when I heard this, I had to get off my chair, just lie on the floor for a while. I mean, it stopped the randomized control trial in its tracks, and we thought we were going to have to give all this money back to the National Institute of Health Research, which would just have been, anyway, like trying to get your baby unborn or whatever. So Matt Ford from NSPCC, who's my right-hand man, we're joined at the hip on this trial. We went and spoke to lots of big legal brains about this. But we found out 18 months after the no randomisation decision that a colleague in London, who no longer works with the trial, I have to say, had described the infant mental health intervention in a way that made it sound as if it would definitely be better than usual practice. And once Sir James realised we genuinely didn't know whether or not the infant mental health service or social work would do better, he became a strong advocate for the trial. It was a fascinating meeting. So we had sent him papers in advance about the Cambridge Somerville trial because, you know, we wanted to get across the point that you can have an intervention that seems so obviously right and is actually wrong. We also sent him a wonderful video called Feast, Anatomy of a Clinical Trial, which, if you're interested, is an absolutely brilliant portrayal of how a randomised controlled trial works. And we also told him, I also told him that my mother was a social worker and she was a bloody good social worker and she knew many excellent social workers. And so I am genuinely not sure whether infant mental health will be better than social work. Because when social work's done well, let's face it, social workers are trained to make these difficult decisions. And we're not trained in that way as psychologists and psychiatrists. So once we'd explained all that to Sir James, he was like, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Of course you can randomise. So he was absolutely correct to make his initial decision. Because he had been led to believe that one trial intervention was definitely superior. And he got straight to the heart of the ethics, which is his job. And he actually said to us, you know, if the infant mental health service is that wonderful, then how is it ethical to randomise Mrs. A to that and Mrs. B to social work? And you can't argue with that. He's absolutely right. The fact is we don't know. We won't know until we finish the trial. So the trial will finish in 2024. I think I'm going to be about 98 by then. I still have honestly no idea whether the new infant mental health service will be cost effective compared to social work. So watch this space. But back to me as an 8-year-old, I was right about the definition of a peer. I was also wrong because there was another definition that I wasn't willing to hear. So my certainty about being right led me to learning nothing new, which makes me wonder, is it a problem that our judicial system leans on legal precedent? So in other words, we act on what's already been established. So in other words, we base our decisions, our legal decisions, on the status quo. And this was explored in a really fantastic paper, came out in 2016 by the Harvard Law Review. And this is a quote from it. And the lawyers and judges who opposed RCTs appeared to have a common motive: certainty as to the right answer. And of course, as I hope I've demonstrated, this is actually an ethical stance. If you're certain that you know the answer, it is not ethical to do a randomized controlled trial. So for example, please let's not do any trials of whether not wearing gloves in the Arctic gives you frostbite, or whether jumping out of a plane without a parachute kills you or not. Please let's not do trials. But there must be many good questions that we really don't know the answer to about law and about policy that could be subjected to trials. So with actually my colleague Phil Wilson and various others, we've got this little kind of science club that meets every few months. And one time, a couple of years ago, we gave ourselves a task of thinking, when we thought back about the randomized controlled trials that we've been involved in, which kinds of people had been easy to persuade of randomisation and who hadn't. And the answer was really surprising. So health workers wasn't surprising. Basic grade social workers. Now everyone said social workers will never accept randomisation. Not true. Health academics didn't generally have a problem. Now this was fascinating to us. Parents who had recently had their children taken into care were generally pretty accepting of randomisation. And we were so worried about this that we went back and did qualitative research to make sure that they really did understand it and were okay with it. And they did understand it and they were okay with it. They maybe hadn't understood it at the time because so much else was happening, but they did understand it. And I wonder if that it's partly to do obviously with the health workers, they're maybe used to trials, but also these are all people who are used to dealing with a lot of daily uncertainty. People that we found very difficult to persuade were, for example, social workers, or it could be therapists who were seeking a particular therapy for their client. So they had some prior certainty that such an intervention was definitely going to be better than the other. Fair enough, I suppose. Social work academics really had a problem with randomisation. And judges really had a problem with it. And I wonder if it is about these prior expectations or coming from a profession where your training expects or requires you to have some certainty, you're supposed to know the answer. If any of you have ever read the book by Ian McEwan, The Children Act, you really get a sense of this, just the massive weight of responsibility that we put on the shoulders of judges. They really are expected to know. So let's go back to this slide that I had earlier on about randomised control trials. So the first medical randomised control trial was 1931, and nearly 2 million of them have happened since. And then the first known judicial randomised control trial was only 2 years after the first medical one. But in 2016, when that fantastic paper was published, there had been fewer than 50 trials in the judiciary. So the judges who are now fantastic advocates of our best services trial are actively examining the legalities of potentially doing more trials in the judiciary. And I think it would be great if we could have more trials of policy initiatives as well, the kinds of things that our governments sign up to. So why do so many people seem to understand and accept the inherent fairness of randomisation? And I wonder if it's partly because so many of us do the lottery. So I dug out a paper about lotteries. And this was a paper called A Secure and Fair Joint E-Lottery Protocol. And it had really helpful kind of stipulations of what you needed for a fair lottery. Two of them really stood out for me. One is public verification. So all the valid lottery tickets and the winning numbers must be verified via that's a lot of these, via a verifiable random function. And that's why you have these televised draws with clear plastic things you can see what's happening. And in trials, the randomized trials equivalent is to ensure the randomization by computer-generated procedures that a human can't tamper with, and that are usually these days published in advance at the start of the trial. Then the second one is fairness. No one must be able to predict the winning result before the winning numbers are announced. And this picture is, I think it's a Spanish lottery. I think it's called something like El Gordo, like big lottery. And you must admit, if you thought your number was in and amongst that lot, you probably would be fairly confident that nobody could predict whether you were going to win or not. And again, in trials, this is ensured by the use of randomization procedures that a human can't tamper with, and also that can't guess at. So, even the randomization is kind of made more complicated so that no one can see who's likely to be coming next. But one of the things I've really learned through all of these trials and tribulations with the trial being stopped and started again is that it's not just about really believing in uncertainty, it's also about getting that message across. So I thought of a silly example, but actually I've just realised that, you know, Cambridge, you're really very good at studies on mood. So maybe somebody will want to actually do this study. It's a randomised controlled trial investigating whether chocolate cake can improve adolescent mood at exam time. I think that's a fair question. So let's imagine that you describe it in this way. We want to test whether occasionally eating chocolate cake, which is full of calories and might cause acne, can improve adolescent mood around exam time compared to a chocolate-free diet. How different is that from this way of describing it? We want to test whether occasionally eating chocolate cake, which has a delicious ganache, chocolate ganache centre that melts in the mouth, can improve adolescent mood around exam time compared to no chocolate cake at all. Well, in the first study, you can imagine that those randomised to the chocolate cake intervention group might be so aware of their weight and their skin problems that they might actually feel more depressed. And then in this version of the trial, if you were in the chocolate intervention group, you might just feel you had lots of treats, and that might actually lift your mood. So unfortunately, your messaging has to be really boring. We want to test whether occasionally eating chocolate cake can improve adolescent mood around exam time compared to not eating chocolate cake around exam time. It's so important not to imply that you know the answer. So what kinds of people can help you get your message across? Well, essentially people who are going to be affected by the outcome of the trial. People who are invested in the trial are going to be able to help with your messaging. So in the trials that I run, this could be health workers, could be social workers. And I've said even here, but I mean, to be honest, it's not really even parents who've had their children removed into care. If the trial is about those parents, it's those people who are going to be able to help you think about the messaging and making sure that it really is ethical. So a few years ago, before we had actually got the funding for the Best Services trial, I was quite worried about this because we had a service user support group, and actually a couple of members of our current group here, which is really nice. We had an adoptive parent, we had a kinship carer, but we didn't have a parent who had had his or her child taken into care. And I was thinking, I don't know how I'm going to achieve this, but actually that is a crucial member of our team. And I was at a conference talking about neurodevelopment or something. It was a conference on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and who should approach me but the wonderful Pip Williams, who was a computing science teacher and the founder of the European Birth Mother Network. And she just approached me at the coffee break. She said, I think you need me as part of your trial team. And I was like, yeah, tell me more. And she said, well, I actually had my children removed in the context of alcohol problems, and you know, I've been in recovery for 20 years, and you know, and she was so incredibly upfront about all of this history. She could see that I needed her. So she was a member of our, we call it the user professional group. We meet every 6 months or so, and we just brainstorm, you know, where we get our information sheets right, we get the messaging right, if we've got issues with recruitment or retention, all of that. And very sadly, Pip died in 2019. And this was just, I was looking for photographs of Pip, and I came across this. So if you're interested in reading more about her, there's a lovely blog that's been written about Pip after she died. And I've put the link in the slide, which I'm happy to circulate. So having that group of people just to support the trial and just keep us right has been absolutely crucial. And so really everyone involved, including, you know, the scientists, all the stakeholders, the public, need to be true collaborators. And I think that has helped us. We've recruited more than 50% of families with a preschool child coming into foster care in Glasgow. And currently 72% are still part of the study 2.5 years later. Hope that continues. We're asking people to take a chance. So all of the scientists, the social workers, the social work managers, the judges, and the families themselves really do need to be working in partnership. And the whole team needs to be willing to constantly re-explain the ethics of randomisation and the fact that we really don't know what the answer will be.